Hello everyone, welcome to version 1.1 of my Resident Evil 3 Remake, Inferno difficulty, no damage, no shop items, S-rank walkthrough, and this is going to be from the hospital area to the final boss fight. This was pretty simple. The hospital area wasn't as bad as I originally thought it was going to be. I mean, I did fail a couple of times on the room that has the two hunters, because that section is just poorly designed. It took me a while to find the right strategy. But the strategy that I found is kind of a variation of Carcinogen SDA strategy, only it uses a lot of ammo, and you're just cheesing the hunters like crazy. Because there's going to be an aspect of Resident Evil 2 Remake that is present in this section, and it's a mechanic that you haven't seen for the full entire game, and it is the ability to stealth enemies. So, in Resident Evil 2 Remake, you could set up in positions where you could stealth past enemies. There would be times where enemies would not be looking at you, and you could walk right past them. If you ran, they would be aware of you. If you fired your gun, they would be aware of you. You could do this on every single enemy except for the G adults and also the IVs. And it was definitely one of my favorite aspects of Resident Evil 2 Remake. Even still though, it doesn't change my opinions on Resident Evil 2 Remake, because I still think that game is just a giant disappointment. But for the sections where you could actually stealth past the enemies, it was incredibly beneficial for knife-only runs. I mean, in the hospital area, you're not really stealthing past enemies. You're taking advantage of the fact that they don't respond to you immediately when you re-enter the room. And this is only ever the case with hunters. Every other enemy, they just know where you are the moment you re-enter a room. So there's really no opportunity to use stealth throughout the full game unless you're doing it against lickers. But this section, you can do it against the hunters. If you leave the room entirely, and sometimes you'll have to go through two doors to make sure that the hunters actually go back to their default positions, they will not attack you immediately when you re-enter the room. It's very helpful, and I'm going to use that against the two hunters in that room where you need to get the tape. And I feel no shame in doing this whatsoever. If the hunters are going to cheese me with their inconsistent designs, and the fact that I'm playing as a character who just isn't very capable of fighting hunters, I'm going to cheese him right back. Like, that room is definitely one of the main parts of Inferno difficulty, where I just really question who thought that was a good idea, to put in two of the same enemy that are just incredibly evasive against a character who has no kind of ability to dodge, and he's just going to get screwed so easily by long-range attacks, and against very evasive enemies. The gameplay just really falls apart in this section, and the fact that I'm having to use this as a strategy is just another reason why I do not like this section coming up. But that's later on. Right now, just take out that zombie and then use the key here. You can get a flash grenade from one of the lockers over here, and you need to save a lot of flash grenades for the defend Jill sequence, because that section can be very random, and you have to make sure you're controlling the zombies properly by using flash grenades. And the good news is, I did not have to use any of my flash grenades for the defend Jill sequence, aside from the final moment of the defend Jill sequence. So I cannot wait to show you the strategy that I used for that section. This part right here, punch the hunter out of the way, and then you have to go to the left, because the hunters have this really stupid property to them. When they are jumping up off the ground, they can actually damage you with their feet. I have never heard of a game putting in an active frame period for a rising animation that doesn't even look like an attack animation. Like, what is that about? That is so stupid. And it can be very problematic when the shove gives you so much forward momentum, and because of that, it can put you in some really bad positions, so you might accidentally put yourself into a position where the hunter can just hit you with their feet. It's so stupid. I have no idea who thought that was a good idea, but that is just one of the dumbest design choices I've seen with this enemy. And it doesn't even make any sense for them to suddenly think, oh, this is a good idea. Like every other Resident Evil game that has had hunters do that exact same rising animation, they have never been able to damage you while they're doing that rising animation. So why they decided on that particular design choice is something that makes absolutely no sense, and it adds absolutely nothing except for frustration. The amount of times I've been hit playing as Carlos is just pathetic. And every single time I have been hit by that rising animation, it's never been my fault. It's always been the game's fault because of the forward momentum from the shove, and with just how clunky the positioning of your character can be when it comes to doing the shove. So you have to be very careful of the rising animation that these hunters can do, and you'll be fine. But that part right there, there is a chance that the hunter will just run off all the way to the right once it notices you, and you can just safely get through the door by just shoving through it. But it's not guaranteed all the time, so I highly recommend that you just punch that hunter out of the way so that you can just get through the door easily. And you always want to shove through the door so that you can get away from the hunter very quickly. And you can also make sure that you don't get detected by the licker. Because one of the coolest things about this game when it comes to the lickers is that the lickers cannot hear you when you shove and when you dodge as Jill. So these can be very helpful when it comes to getting through these licker rooms quickly, because you need to have a lot of patience when it comes to stealthing past lickers. Because these parts can take quite a while to do, and you're just waiting for the licker to just complete their path. But lure the licker over there, and then just start shoving, just to move a little bit faster. If you want to recover faster from the shove animation, just aim. This does not reset the cooldown on the shove, however, so you still have to wait for the cooldown on the shove to be ready before it allows you to shove again. Now, get this Palehead out of the way, because he can be quite a nuisance, because I'm going to be using this room to my advantage when it comes to getting to a safe spot away from one of the hunters. And now we are going to be coming across the dreaded hunter room that is so poorly designed, I will never understand why New Capcom thinks this is acceptable. So the first thing you're going to have to do is open the door so that you can lure this first hunter over here. But his AI is so stupid that you have to open this door several times before he actually decides to get through the door. And you can tell he's not going to get through the door because you can hear him, like, grunting as if he's running. If you can hear him grunting, it means he's not going to get through the door. And the moment he stops grunting, it means he's going to get through the door when you step back over here. So now that he's here, I can safely dispatch him and not have to deal with the other hunter. And I say safely as if this is the safest method for getting rid of this guy, but it really isn't. It's just prone to a lot of error on the game's part. Like, where you're going to be when you decide to shove. The game put me right behind him, and I punched him, and he could have easily damaged me with his rising animation. And then there's also that, if he decides to evade or not. And if you get screwed by the evade, there is a high possibility that you will miss your cross punch, and you'll get screwed by really bad detection. But what I'm doing here is every time I come back into this room, it forces the hunter to try to go back into the room he was just in, but he can't. So he keeps running into the door, and then the moment I re-enter the room, he's going to start to prioritize me again. And most of the time, he'll be running into me, and he doesn't seem to do an attack animation when he's running. Or maybe he is, but it's just a very slow running attack. I mean, there are times when he can evade though, so you have to be very careful of that. But the main gist of it is you need to knock him over using your cross punch, and then you need to follow up with aiming afterwards, because when you are in that state, after you successfully nail a cross punch, you fire your weapon incredibly fast. So your fire rate is heavily increased, and that allows you to deal a lot of damage to the hunter before he has a chance to recover. And if you can hit his head, that's even more beneficial, because you'll be able to damage his head very easily. But the main problem is, Carlos's punish after he does the cross punch is only reliable if you can actually knock the enemies into a position where their weak spots are visible. And in the case of hunters, whenever you knock them back using the cross punch, most of the time, it's just so hard to hit their head. And it makes it less reliable than Jill's dodge, because for Jill's dodge, she's not knocking over the enemy. She's able to get a clear shot into the enemy's weak spot, because they're not in any kind of knockdown position. So I'm going to be wasting a lot of ammo trying to hit this guy, and I'm not even prioritizing his weak spot, I'm just laying everything I have into him. But hunters just have incredible amounts of life, and I'm going to end up running out of ammo entirely, and I'm very lucky that I picked up the extended mag from that safe, because whenever you put the extended mag on your assault rifle, you gain an additional 64 bullets, so you can use it as a backup, rather than just reloading your assault rifle. But this guy just will not die. The last shot from my pistol will actually kill this guy. It's just so dumb that hunters have this much life. And another thing that really bothers me is that the assault rifle can't even stun lock hunters. On the original version of Resident Evil 3, the assault rifle was one of the best weapons ever when it came to eliciting hit stun. It was the same case with the silenced machine gun that you had in Resident Evil 2, the original version. Those machine guns could stun lock enemies, and it was definitely a nice balance, because you couldn't even get assault rifle ammo on those games. It was percentage-based rather than ammo-based, so you had a set percentage, and that was the amount of machine gun ammo that you had to fire. But every shot that you fired mattered, because they elicited a hit stun, and you could keep enemies stun-locked, and it perfectly balanced out the hunters on Resident Evil 3. But in this game, they've completely removed that, so the hunters are just bullet sponges, and they don't even flinch properly unless you shoot them in the head. The moment you expose their weak spot, they will actually flinch. But even still though, the clunkiness of the soft lock is not going to help you out a lot when it comes to dealing with these guys. In fact, my best recommendation is after you stun a hunter, you always want to make sure that you readjust yourself so that you're set up perfectly to punch them or to run away. Because the hunters on this game are very quick when it comes to attacking you, and you do not want to put yourself in a position where they can do that. But he finally goes down after every single bullet I had, and there was actually 30 assault rifle rounds I could have used, but I forgot about it at the time, but I remembered they were there. And now we can progress onwards. But, yeah guys, does that not look like the dumbest section ever? Like, that kind of section doesn't complement the Hunter's design whatsoever. It's really bad. And putting 2 Hunters in there, like, what is that? It's just so bad. That just feels like the kind of design a toddler would come up with without fully understanding how much of an impact it has on the gameplay. And the gameplay was severely impacted. Like, that just looked awful. And you can't even make the argument of, oh, just use a flash grenade against those 2 Hunters. If the developers intended for that kind of design, why would they place the first Hunter so close to the door? And why would they make it so that he can see you the moment you open the door? That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And even still, though, the flash grenade would have been helpful in the long run, because the Hunter's going to attack you during the stun animation, and you're going to have to waste a lot of flash grenades if you want to get out of that room safely without being hit. And I need these flash grenades for the Defend Jill sequence, because the Defend Jill sequence can be very random without the flash grenades. So, I just wish that section was better designed. That's all I'll leave it to in the end. But we're about to pick up the vaccine after we examine that audio tape of Dr. Bard, which, in all honesty, feels like fan service, just to keep you playing the game. And I just think that's really dumb. Like, it almost reminds me of Carcinogen SDA's interview with Hideki Kamiya, where he tried to answer a lot of Carcinogen SDA's questions with a cheap substitute, where he would just say these one-liners in such an action-y tone, just as a way of answering Carcinogen SDA's questions about the lore, or about any characters potentially returning. Like, he'd be like, Billy will return. Which was obviously not true, so everyone would just start to laugh at him, and while it may seem funny in the moment, when you look at it as a whole, it just seemed like Hideki Kamiya was very reliant upon fan service in order to make sure he wasn't putting a bad light on himself, and it really didn't sound funny overall. But with Ayoma-san, the times where he would feel funny, they felt properly placed, and he wasn't so reliant upon fan service when it came to answering Carcinogen SDA's questions. He was very well versed with the lore, so he could answer the questions properly compared to Hideki Kamiya, and that really goes to show the differences between the directors of Resident Evil. But enough about that tangent. We're currently doing the Defend Jill sequence, and you need to make sure you kill these exact zombies. You need to kill 3 of these zombies, and make sure that there are only 4 left over. If you keep 4 zombies left over, you will stop the spawn of zombies so long as they're alive. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the enemies stay very close to that generator, so that when I shoot the generator, they'll be stunned. And you have to be very careful about zombies that do the any alpha grab, because they can cover quite a range with that grab. So you have to make sure you're standing behind objects so that you don't get hit by it. And if that option isn't available to you, get ready to counter them. But another important thing you need to bear in mind is always make sure that all the zombies are facing in one direction, so that they have less time to initiate the grab while they're turning around. And it also buys you enough time to punch them out of the way. So, right now, all of the zombies are facing in that general direction, so I'm going to get behind them, and then the moment they recover, I'm going to stand at a distance, and I'm going to do Method 1 for doing the cross punch, where you press R1 during the recovery frames of the shove animation in order to do the punch. The main reason why you want to do that is because the forward momentum from the shove can put you in some really bad positions, so you might accidentally put yourself in front of a zombie and they'll grab you. So I'm not going to allow that. I'm going to stand at a distance and I will just punch them. That way I don't get screwed by the forward momentum of the shove. But this is really where Resident Evil 4 mechanics are going to come into play, because the stumble mechanic from Resident Evil 4, where you knock one enemy into another and they get stumbled back, it's back in this game now, and it's more noticeable during this section. So I'm going to be able to control the zombies very easily, so I'll be able to punch this zombie into the ones that have broken out of the stun, and they're going to get pushed forward, so it buys me a lot of time in order to set them up. This is a very helpful mechanic for balancing out this section. Now, Tyrell has just warned us that we need to find the breaker, so that means the hunter's going to spawn. So the moment the hunter bashes the door, throw the grenade and he will die. It'll get him through the door. I had a really stupid moment where I tried to throw my grenades over the table, and both of my grenades got caught on the table and on the ceiling because of the two different grenade throwing animations. If you want to see that fail, check out my most recent poor designs of RE3 Remake videos, because it's just so stupid. I don't know what the developers were thinking with the grenade throwing. Like, the grenades were already bad enough in Resident Evil 2 Remake, and on this game they're a lot more reliable, but when you put in two different throwing animations that are completely dependent upon the camera, it's very easy to get screwed by the grenade throwing animation if your camera is slightly off, and it's very hard to tell if that is the case. Once again, new Capcom doing what it does best with introducing questionable design choices that add nothing to the game aside from frustration, and it really brings down this game's quality. Same with Resident Evil 2 Remake. But another important thing I forgot to mention about this particular strategy is you need to make sure you stand in a particular position when the zombies are rising above the ground. The zombie pathing on this game is absolutely horrendous. They're like drunk zombies. They just wander all over the place. They can't walk in straight lines. They practically favor the longest path over the shortest path. It's just so dumb, and a lot of the times you get screwed by that. And some of the mechanics of Resident Evil 3, like the dodge and also the counter you can do with the shove, are very dependent upon the direction the zombies are moving, and when their movement is very erratic, the chances of you performing those specific actions are less, because there's no telling what grab the zombies will do, because they do different grabs depending on where you're standing. And it's just such a dumb design choice, and once again, I don't know how new Capcom could do this. They've made so many other Resident Evil games where the enemies are perfectly capable at pathfinding, but now, when we go to Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, we now have drunk enemies that can't walk in straight lines. So because of this specific factor, you have to make sure you stand in the right spot so that by the time the zombies recover from their stun animation, they will always go towards you, and they will always favor the shortest path. Now, that right there, at a particular point after Tyrell says almost got it, when the shutters are close to head height, you need to be prepared to throw a grenade at that particular window where the hunter spawns so that you can kill him, and you can also get rid of the other zombies, because the moment the hunter spawns, you are free to get rid of the other zombies, because the shutters will be closed enough that the zombies won't be able to get through the windows. Now, for this final part, just use all the flash grenades you have, and just make sure you plant the explosive, wait for 30 seconds, and then the sequence will be over. And you have just done one of the hardest parts of the game to do no damage. And I have to give credit to Capcom for at least trying to diversify the kind of sections you come across, because Carlos feels very different to how Jill plays, and the kind of sections he gets into, like this, they feel very different to what Jill gets into. The Carlos definitely received a better treatment from the developers compared to the side characters from Resident Evil 2 Remake, namely Sherry and Ada. Sherry was just in an interactive cutscene moment with Chief Irons, and then Ada is just running past a bunch of zombies and just doing minor puzzles, and that's it. That's all you did as the side characters, and their sections were very short, and they didn't diversify the gameplay in a way that's interesting, but at least Carlos had sections that actually feel very different to what Jill does, and he plays so differently compared to Jill. That's exactly how you make side character content feel different and unique from the main experience. But we're not playing as Jill again, and it's going to be a very slow moment, and the sections coming up are pretty easy, and as long as you have enough magnum ammo and enough grenade rounds, you're going to be fine. I was very lucky to have not wasted so many mine rounds on Nemesis 2, so I have a lot of mine rounds available for use, and it's going to make a lot of the sections that I struggled with previously in my original walkthrough a little bit easier. And just like what I did previously in my original walkthrough, I'm not going to explore the full hospital. I'm only going to loot one crate which has magnum ammo, and that will be it. And seeing how this is a very slow part of the game and the section is relatively easy, I'm just going to go off on a different tangent, and I'm going to build off a previous tangent that I stated back in my first part of this walkthrough. And it builds off of what I said previously about Resident Evil 2 Remake not having as much content, and why I feel like this game feels like a more realized game. And it links to a criticism that this game receives a lot of. So, one of the biggest criticisms that Resident Evil 3 Remake receives is that the fact that they've negated so much of the original Resident Evil 3's areas and set pieces and content has really caused this game to feel more like a cash grab compared to Resident Evil 2 Remake in so many people's minds. But in my opinion, I just don't see that at all. I feel like the roles are reversed in this case. I feel like Resident Evil 2 Remake was the cash grab, but then this game is more of a fully realized game. And to further elaborate on this, the only reason Resident Evil 2 Remake doesn't receive criticism for lack of content is because the original Resident Evil 2 was a tiny game mainly confined to the RPD building, while the rest of the areas do not compare. Like, the remake of Resident Evil 2 cannot be criticized for lack of content, because there was not a lot of content to remake. You know, you didn't really notice a lot of areas that were completely changed, or felt like they were lost in the remake, because there's not a lot of stuff there to remake in the first place. And when it comes to Resident Evil 3 Remake, like, people shouldn't be complaining about Resident Evil 3 Remake's lack of content, considering that it uses Resident Evil 2 Remake as its template. Like, since Resident Evil 2 Remake is built for speedrunning and only that, Resident Evil 3 Remake had to be made the same, which is why a lot of stuff was cut out from the game. It's the result of the developer sticking only to what works, which ultimately backfired in the end when it came to fans' criticisms. Like, I'm aware of the fact that this game did negate a lot of areas and a lot of set pieces, like, for instance, with the park area and also with the Gravedigger, which, in all honesty, guys, I'm really glad those kind of moments didn't get into this game, because I imagine new Capcom would have messed them up greatly, and just made them very uninteresting, considering that they made a lot of really poor errors with Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake. But even still, though, I just can't agree with those people who try to voice this criticism of Resident Evil 3 Remake having a lack of content. Despite the lack of content, I still feel like that Resident Evil 3 Remake has more interesting content in set pieces than Resident Evil 2 Remake. And on the topic of the set pieces that were negated from the game, such as with the moment where Brad was killed by Nemesis, what would be the whole point of reintroducing such moments? In the moment, it's cool, but when you look at it as a whole, what impact does it really have on the story and on the survival horror aspect in the end? The only people who will benefit from these remakes are well-versed Resident Evil players, and such moments would come across as predictable, which is why they changed such moments. Capcom did nothing wrong, they just followed the rules of remaking a game. And on a side note, nobody complained about Mr. X's introduction in Resident Evil 2 Remake. We never ever see the moment where he falls out of the Umbrella helicopter. All he does is just lift the helicopter up with no build up to that point. The reason why it's like that is to once again make it have a different feeling, as the remakes are built for well-versed Resident Evil players who have already seen such moments prior. Talk about hypocritical behavior. At least on the content side, Resident Evil 3 Remake doesn't try to make itself a joke when it comes to putting out laughable content, because this game didn't have any kind of DLC. Resident Evil 2 Remake, on the other hand, decided to put out that stupid Ghost Survivors DLC content, which was just a reskin of Fort Survivor mode, and then you had that one survival mode, which wasn't even as interesting as the Night Terror DLC from Resident Evil 7, because at least on the Night Terror DLC, you had cool music playing, you had different traps you could set, you had a very interesting way of getting currency, like, the game gave you so many different things you could buy, and then you had the different enemy types coming, and then you had the boss fights with Jack, which were a lot of fun. And then what do we get in the No Way Out scenario for Resident Evil 2 Remake? They placed us in the gas station area, and we're only fighting zombies. And then occasionally you come across a new enemy type, which is just the poison zombies, the armored zombies, or the pale-head zombies, or zombies that have a gas cylinder or a backpack, and when the enemies drop the gas cylinder, it can be used as a trap, and when they drop their backpacks, you can get additional weapons. I mean, it sounds like a really cool idea, but when it comes to doing it, it just gets so boring and repetitive after a while. And the new enemy types aren't even that intriguing, because all they did was just change certain fundamental parameters on the zombies, and that was it. They didn't add any new animations, they didn't add any kind of new enemy type. All they did was just change up the typical zombie so that they have these different parameters. That's it. Not very interesting. I mean, it's definitely better than the other pieces of content involved in the Ghost Survivors DLC, but even still, though, it's just not very replayable. And the DLC for Resident Evil 2 Remake was just a joke. And it just further cemented Resident Evil 2 Remake's place as being my least favorite Resident Evil game, by far, and with introducing such lackluster content. And I can't even voice that same complaint with Resident Evil 3 Remake, because it doesn't have any DLCs. It just has its campaign, which doesn't feel as simplistically designed as Resident Evil 2 Remake's campaigns. Like, the scenarios on Resident Evil 2 Remake, they're all just the same thing, but with some minute adjustments to them. The enemies are so simplistically designed. The weapons aren't even very interesting. Like, that whole entire game is just designed for knife only. Whereas with this game, it doesn't feel like that at all. At least the guns on this game have a purpose. And the enemies on this game demand a lot more, even if the incentive for dealing with them is not the best incentive, because the only reason you want to kill those enemies is because they're poorly designed. But at least it's an incentive. I'll at least give the game that. And the whole entire game is built around that particular restriction, because there are parts of this game where if you don't have specific ammo, you are going to get screwed. So to sum it all up, I really feel like Resident Evil 3 Remake is just a more realized Resident Evil game compared to Resident Evil 2 Remake, which just settled on some really lackluster design choices. And that has been the whole entire warehouse sequence. You don't really need any commentary to explain what to do, because it's very easy to do. I mean, the laboratory section will definitely demand a little bit more, because this was actually a part that gave me a bit of trouble, and I actually ran out of ammo for one particular part of the laboratory sequence. And the sequence in question was the room where you fight those 5 hunters, because originally, I decided not to bring my knife into this section here because I didn't think I would need it, but it turns out I really did need it, because I ran out of ammo entirely for the hunters, and because I didn't have my knife, I couldn't kill them, so I had to restart the whole entire section again, and I never thought I would ever put myself into a position where I would not have any ammo, so that was a first for me. And it's precisely why I always keep the knife with me at all times, because I always feel very comfortable having my knife out, or just having it in my inventory in a Resident Evil game. That's just how comfortable I am with the knives on Resident Evil games. But after picking up the override key, I'm going to use my magnum ammo in order to clear out all the paleheads in this room. And I'm going to take a very risky approach to killing these paleheads, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to dodge right into them, and I'm just going to shoot them in the head by using the soft lock. It's a very risky method because paleheads are some of the most broken enemies in the game, because they have a habit of grabbing you by doing a second grab during your roll animation, and it's the case with a lot of the other enemies on this game where they can do that second grab on hardcore difficulty and above. And because of this particular factor, I have to make sure I don't accidentally roll into the palehead, because if I roll into the palehead, I won't gain a lot of momentum, and he'll be able to grab me and do the second grab. But at the same time, I don't have to worry about aiming my reticle, because the game will already do that for me when I'm doing the roll animation. And aiming at paleheads can be pretty tricky because they move around a lot. And I understand why they decided to put in paleheads in this game, because of the fact that it's a faster-paced Resident Evil game, and the dodge system perfectly accommodates for the paleheads. But I just don't understand why they had to reuse this enemy type in this game from a really bad DLC from Resident Evil 2 Remake. Like, they could have introduced something completely different, but they just decided to settle on a lazier option with the paleheads. And it's just so dumb. I really don't appreciate the paleheads on this game. But all the enemies in these previous rooms have been dealt with, and it's very important that you deal with them, because these guys have a habit of standing right behind doors, so that when you go through the door, they just immediately grab you. It's some bullcrap inherited from Resident Evil 2 Remake, and I don't like it whatsoever. They should never, ever place enemies so close to the door. There should have been some kind of safeguard put in place, where they make it so that the enemies never stand near doors. And the fact that they can do that on this game is completely bullcrap, and it completely forces you to kill the enemies. Like, it's just so dumb, and either way, you still have to get rid of these paleheads, because they can be quite a nuisance whenever you're backtracking back through this area. But make sure you're picking up all the explosives around here. You'll definitely need acid rounds and grenade rounds for the hunters. Acid rounds are really good against hunters, because they put them into a very hard stun, and it takes 2 acid rounds to kill hunters. And one of the best methods for getting rid of hunters on this section is to use an acid round to stun 2 of them, and then using either explosive or mine rounds in order to deal the remaining damage to finish them off. And you can get in total 4 acid rounds for this part, and this is really the only part of the game where I use acid rounds, because acid rounds just don't have any other utility in any part of the game, because you can get most of the other sections done with just normal grenades. And then with the flame rounds, I only ever use the flame rounds against Nemesis 2, and I never really find the opportunity to use acid rounds against Nemesis 2, because I already used up all of my acid rounds trying to kill these 5 hunters. Oh, and speaking of the grenade rounds, I actually forgot to bring one of my explosives into this part. I forgot to bring in Explosive A that I picked up back in the warehouse area in order to make explosive rounds for this part, but I at least had mine rounds to help accommodate for the situation. And mine rounds aren't as damaging as explosive rounds, but they're still pretty useful nonetheless. And that whole part just then, with me finishing off those Any-Alpha parasites, trying to finish off those Any-Alpha parasites with just the pistol was so difficult to do in my original walkthrough. So you definitely want to make sure that you don't use a single mine round against Nemesis 2 and just save your mine rounds for this part right here, because it's definitely clear that developers want you to use the grenade launcher to clear out all the enemies here, because these enemies take a beating. Both the Any-Alpha parasites and the paleheads, they take a tremendous beating from a lot of different weapons. But here is the section with the hunters. So this part right here is always going to be consistent. So this guy will always growl, but then the other guy will just be running towards him, and I can use an acid round to stun both of them. And I'm actually going to use another acid round in order to finish him off, because I know I have 2 other acid rounds for the other hunters. And I know this is going to kill them. If it doesn't kill them, I'm just going to swap to my mine rounds and finish them off. But this part right here, just go to this side of the arena, and just use an acid round to stun both of them. And then you're going to need to use your mine rounds here. I run out of mine rounds on this part, but I was able to make up for it with the shotgun that I used against the next hunter coming up. And I was able to shoot them out of the air, which was cool. I always like the moments where you can shoot enemies out of the air in Resident Evil games, because it feels like a Resident Evil thing, and it really benefits the realistic feedback aspect of the weapons. And it makes the weapons feel very cool when you just shoot enemies out of the air. But that was the last threat before Nemesis 3, and because it was the last threat, I'm just going to transition directly over to the vaccine synthesis chamber, since you already know how to get to it, since you played the other difficulties to unlock Inferno difficulty. And the puzzle here is mid, high, low, and it's always going to be the same. There's none of that randomization of the puzzle answers like in the original version of Resident Evil 3. And now the game is going to give us an opportunity to prepare for Nemesis 3. And as I stated before in my first part, Nemesis 3 is the worst boss on this game, because not only is it a complete reskin of the Nemesis 2 boss fight, but he has zombies supporting him now, and on this difficulty, and also on Nightmare difficulty, he can have Palehead supporting him too. So they've decided to put in a poorly designed enemy in a lazy excuse of a boss fight. That statement shouldn't exist when it comes to Nemesis. He's the titular antagonist of Resident Evil 3, yet he needs zombies to support him, which only goes to show just how pathetic his boss fight is. I've never been so disappointed with a Resident Evil boss before, although unless you count Salazar, that's a different story, or with the Infected Bat, or the final boss fight of Resident Evil 0, those boss fights are way worse compared to Nemesis in this game. But even still though, this is just completely unacceptable for a boss fight. They could have done so many cool things with this boss fight. They didn't have to drag it out so much just to artificially inflate the difficulty. They could have done so much more. You know, the treatment plant fight in the original version of Resident Evil 3, you just hit a bunch of valves, and it kills Nemesis so quickly if you know exactly how to manipulate him, and it was very tricky to do so, and it complemented knife only as well. It was a lot of fun, but this isn't fun at all. It's just rehashed boss design that follows the exact same poor mentality as the second boss fight. Like, what were they thinking when they designed this? This game did not have a low budget, surely. If this game had no low budget, why would they settle with this kind of boss design? It's just so questionable. I will never understand the developers of this game. I only hope that Resident Evil 8's developers are nothing like this, and I have seen the trailer for Resident Evil 8, and I've done a trailer analysis, and it looks so great. I am so hyped for Resident Evil 8, and it's going to definitely blow me away with the kind of designs they're going to go for with that game. And thankfully, it is not following Resident Evil 2 Remake's template. It's following Resident Evil 7 as a template. It's definitely the best thing they could have done with Resident Evil 8. Of course, that's meaningless if New Capcom is developing Resident Evil 8. If the same team that made Resident Evil 7 is developing Resident Evil 8, which I don't think it is, because I remember in one of the leaks, it did specify that the director of Resident Evil 8 would be someone who has only directed one Resident Evil game, but he's been an executive producer the whole entire time, which doesn't really make any sense to me. It doesn't really make sense that he would be an executive producer the whole entire time. But if that is the case, I don't know if it's going to be the director of Resident Evil 7. I'm not even sure if he fits the criteria that's been listed by that leak. So, I only hope that the director of Resident Evil 8 is someone who's actually good at making good games. Unlike the director who made Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake. But this is the boss fight, and I've already done the first phase, and we're now on the second phase. So for the first phase, you obviously want to stun them with flame rounds, and then shoot them twice with explosive rounds, then swap back to flame rounds, shoot them, and then repeat the process until eventually you get stunned. And for the second phase, you can still continue the exact same chain until you run out of ammo. The moment you run out of ammo, that's where he's going to start spawning in zombies, the moment he gets onto the outskirts of the arena. And when he jumps onto the generators, you obviously want to shoot the 2 buttons in order to make sure he falls off, but it does absolutely no damage, which is stupid. It's just like in the second boss fight, where you shoot him off the outskirts of the arena with a grenade launcher, but the fall doesn't damage him whatsoever. And it only does 1% of damage, because that's just how much damage the grenade rounds do to him, and it's the same with the mine rounds, which, again, doesn't make any sense for a grenade launcher to behave like that. The only time the generators will actually do damage to Nemesis is in the third phase, because what happens on the third phase is when you stun him with the generators, he will be opened up to being hit by Carlos, and this is the third phase right now. So I've just stunned Nemesis, he's staying on there, and this is giving Carlos the opportunity to dump acid on him, and look at that just then. That payload was very close to catching me, which is so stupid. There's a reason why you don't put in a very fast enemy that covers a lot of range when this fight has one big bug. It's the same with the second fight as well. Whenever you aim your gun, for some reason the camera gets stuck, and you're seeing it right now. Why is the camera stuck? Why is it only during this boss fight and also the second boss fight where the camera gets stuck when you aim? And the only way to fix this issue is to dodge, or to just stand still and just wait for the camera to fix itself. So, because of how close the camera is whenever you're trying to keep your distance from Nemesis after aiming, it makes it very hard to triangulate where the payloads can be. Oh, and that right there, every even time Nemesis starts to run on the outskirts of the arena, he's going to do a jump attack on you, and you have to dodge to the sides. And when he does this move right here, you have to make sure that you dodge at this one right here, and you're dodging perpendicular to him, because that move has a really bad hitbox where he can grab you way too early into that attack. Like, he can grab you before he's even touched you. It's so stupid. And you do not want to get grabbed by that attack, because if you get grabbed, he will instantly kill you. And there's nothing you can do about it, unfortunately. But also, in the third phase, Nemesis can do this tentacle combo, but I haven't seen that move for such a long time, and I think as long as you're running away from him, he never tries to do it. I think he's mainly prioritizing the running attack rather than doing the tentacle combo. I think he only does a tentacle combo if you stay close to him. But I'm taking a risk here with dodging this pale head, and thankfully it did the any-alpha grab. Normally when the enemies do the any-alpha grab and you dodge it, they never try to do the second hit. The same cannot be said when the enemies do the hardcore difficulty grab. When they do the hardcore difficulty grab, because they're not covering a lot of range, they are very close to you when you do the dodge, so they can initiate the second grab very easily. And in the case of pale heads, they will catch you all the time. There's no getting away from them if they decide to do the hardcore difficulty grab, unless you somehow don't roll into them. Something you need to note about the enemies in this boss fight, they're not infinite. There is actually a point where Nemesis will kill enough of these zombies that they stop spawning in, and you'll know you're on the last wave of zombies when they're all pale heads, and this particular wave will repeat 3 times, and after the 3rd time seeing a full wave of pale heads, they will not spawn in after Nemesis kills them. And also, be very careful of that. There are times when Nemesis can do a horizontal attack on thin air, and if he does the horizontal attack on thin air, it means he's most likely going to follow up with a long-range tentacle slab, and you gotta be prepared for it. But just keep running away from him. There's the tentacle attack again, so be very mindful of that. Always make sure you're just hugging the outskirts of the arena, and just make sure you are keeping watch over the zombies. But Nemesis is heading on the outskirts of the arena right now, and this will actually be the final hit I will deal to Nemesis when he decides to jump back onto the generator, because this is the 3rd time I'm hitting him with the acid. And Nemesis normally jumps onto the generator a second after Carlos indicates that enemies are spawning in, and he's doing it right now, and he is done for. So just make sure you can survive the rest of the enemies so that this cutscene will trigger, and you will do this boss fight very effectively. And I managed to do this on the first try, which is exactly the same case that happened in the original walkthrough, so I'm very happy about that. Now we are on to the final boss fight, which I didn't even need to make a save for because I was able to nail this on the first try. This is a first for me. I don't think I've ever done Final Nemesis no damage on the first try. It's always been constant restarts because of his crappy hitboxes and his perfect aiming pustules. The good news is, my time spent fighting this boss knife only has allowed me to discover new ways of dodging some of his attacks. And the most annoying move that he has is the chain slam move, and it's the move that everybody hates, but I figured out the best way to avoid it thanks to my knife-only attempt, which I managed to do successfully. And speaking of knife-only, I was able to beat all the bosses on this game knife-only. It was definitely a frustrating experience trying to do the first, second, and third boss fights knife-only, but this boss fight, it was actually a lot of fun doing it knife-only, even if I did drag out the scenario a little bit too much. But whatever. Let's just get started on this boss fight. So, after hitting him with the railgun, Nemesis is going to immediately attack you. Always make sure you're staying near the back and just watch what he does. For this move right here, you always want to make sure you're standing near the back and just dodge the final hit. Now you're just going to have to follow up with doing damage to his pustules. And then when you're standing on the right-hand side of the arena, he's going to do this particular drag move where you'll go right, left, right. And then you will always follow that up with the chain slam. But this is how you dodge the chain slam. Before Nemesis has a chance to do his 5th hit, you need to keep rolling into these corners over here. So you can roll into this corner over here, and you can also roll into the opposite corner. If you get into those corners, Nemesis will never be able to hit you. But you have to be very careful that you don't exit that corner too soon, because the slam that he does has really bad detection. He can hit you with phantom range. If you haven't seen the kind of phantom range that move has, check out my poor designs of RE3 Remake videos. But that move right there was a 3-hit combo. The last hit on that 3-hit combo varies in time. So it could come out very quickly, but other times it might come out very slowly. So you have to be very careful of that. But I've shot all the pustules, and now I'm just going to push one of these battery cells in. You can get 2 of these battery cells. I did it previously in my original walkthrough, but unfortunately, I wasn't set up in the right spot to put myself in a position to do that. So I had no choice but to only push in 1 battery cell. And he's doing the drag move again, so I know he's going to follow up with the chain slam. The reason why you want to make sure you get to this corner before he does the 5th hit is because the 5th hit and onward, he can delay one of those hits. And it's very hard to time, so you have to make sure you're not putting yourself in a position to do that. And that's why it's always best to roll into those corners. But you have to be very careful if you're planning on standing in that corner and shooting the pustules. You can dodge the pustules, but it's very hard to predict at times. So you have got to be very, very careful when it comes to shooting those pustules in that corner there. And I'm going to take the time to push this in now that I've shot all the pustules once again. And instead of going back over to the right-hand side of the arena, I'm going to stay on this side of the arena. And I'm going to take the time to shoot these pustules. When you're on the side of the arena and he does this drag move, I highly recommend you stand over here and dodge into the wall. That way it's easier to predict when you're supposed to get past that move. And whenever he does this particular drag move, he will always follow it up with a 3-hit combo. So I'm going to use this to my advantage in order to get back over to the right-hand side of the arena because I don't have any ammo. And the game gives you a lot of pistol rounds, so you have plenty of ammo in order to shoot these pustules. But some of the other moves that Nemesis can do, he can do a roar, which you can dodge the roar so long as you press the dodge button a second after he does his roar. If you get stunned by the roar, you've got to mash the buttons and rotate the analog stick if you want to recover very fast from the animation, because he will always follow it up with a 3-hit combo whenever you get stunned by it. If you are close to Nemesis, he can do this drag move where he will put both of his arms down and he will drag his arms across the arena, but then he'll drag his arms back towards him, so you gotta be very careful of that. And he can also do a move where he crosses both of his arms and he will try to slam you. The important thing you have to realize about the cross slam move is that sometimes he can follow it up with a repeated slam move, and then he will follow it up with a big slam. So you never want to dodge towards him so that you can easily avoid it. Now, that right there, the reason why I'm interacting with that power cell is because when his arms are not glowing, he will try to do a slower grab move, and you can use that to cancel his attack animations if you put yourself in that really bad spot. If his arms are glowing and you interact with that power cell, he will just immediately cancel into a very fast grab, and you'll never be able to get away from it. But that right there is the final down, and I will be able to push this power cell in, and once you get over to the rail cannon, you've practically done the fight, and you can take out Nemesis, and then deal the final shot to Nikolai, and that will be the end of this game. This has been version 1.1 of my Resident Evil 3 Remake, Inferno difficulty, no damage, no shop items, S rank walkthrough. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.